Do not let the cute puppy fool you. This video is serious business. That's right, we are here today to answer the big question. Do I even like fantasy? Also, we got a couple of other questions, but we'll get to them later. Firstly, I got to give you a little bit of context. So in 2022, I decided that I was going to intentionally try to read more genre fiction. Prior to that, I was pretty much exclusively like a non-fiction and lit-fic girly. But since last year, I've been trying a couple of genres, in particular mystery and fantasy. Fantasy would be the main one. And if you've been following this channel, you probably would have seen me ranting about a lot of the, most widely loved fantasy books that I just absolutely hated. For example, some Brandon Sanderson, The Priory of the Orange Tree, The Starless Sea even. I mean, all of these are some of my least favorite books I've ever read. And so I have taken the time to write down, I think every adult fantasy book, like some are sci-fi, but under that genre umbrella that I have read in the last 2 years. And I wanted to have a little bit of an exploration, a dig through this data to answer the question firstly, do I even like fantasy? Is continuing to read this genre like an experiment that's worth my time? And secondly, I also wanted to take a look and see if we can find any commonalities with the books that I am enjoying, to see if there's any particular subgenres or niches within the fantasy genre that I need to be taking a closer look at. Now, to be clear, I have not included any books that I would consider YA or that are very clearly targeted towards young adults, because to be perfectly honest, I've had even less luck with young adult fantasy, and that would just drag this whole thing down. And as a children's bookseller, sometimes I have to read YA that I don't necessarily love, and that's kind of like a separate question. But in terms of me, the reader that I am in my own personal life, I need to better understand my own personal relationship with adult fantasy. So let's start first with some really basic numbers. Can you help me with my maths, Ollie? It's not my strong suit. So since the beginning of 2022, I have read or attempted to read 40 books that I would consider fantasy. 7 of those books I have DNF'd. That's almost 20%. That's a really high ratio for DNFs, especially for me, which is definitely not a statistic in favor of fantasy for me as a reader. If we take a look at the average rating I have given fantasy last year and this year, if we don't include the DNFs, so if I take them out of the equation, my average rating is 3.48. So around a 3.5. Not too bad, but not great either. If I include the DNFs and assign them all 1 star, then we drop down to a 3.05. Oof, that is rough. For context, my average on GoodReads, my rating overall ever since I've been on GoodReads is 3.76. And indeed, my average just for this year in my own tracking is 3.76. Clearly, fantasy is not meeting the mark, even when we remove those DNFs from the equation. And to be perfectly honest, I don't really think it's fair to just entirely ignore those DNFs, because obviously they have had an impact on my enjoyment as a reader over the last 2 years, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's not looking too good for fantasy right now, is it? However, having said that, I did arrange the books on my little list in 2 separate categories. I listed first the books that I gave 3.5 stars and above, and secondly, the books that I gave 3 stars and lower. Because to me, 3.5 stars is a book that I really enjoyed reading. I might not have loved it, but I really enjoyed my time with it. And then when we get to the 4, 4.5, 5s, obviously love. Whereas 3 is kind of I had mixed feelings about it. I liked elements of it, but I didn't really love it. And obviously 2 stars, 1 star, hated. And honestly, it's split 50-50 down the middle. I've got 20 books that I've given 3.5 stars and above, and 20 books that I've given 3 stars and lower, or DNF'd. I would say, you want a high five, Ollie? Hello. So I think in terms of the question, do I even like fantasy? The answer is yes, I can absolutely love it. And when it works for me, it's the best time I've ever had. But now that I have read a decent amount of fantasy and I'm starting to get a sense of what kinds of things I do and don't like in my fantasy, I think I do need to start getting a little bit more intentional about trying specific kinds of subgenres that clearly seem to be working more for me than others. So now let's take a look at the books in their kind of different categories of whether I liked and disliked them, and have a look see if we can pinpoint some similarities there. So let's firstly start with the fantasy books that I've DNF'd in the last 2 years. As I mentioned, there's 7 of them. And looking at these, most of these are pretty well hyped and beloved books or by beloved authors. So a lot of these are the kind of books that I was honestly roped in by the hype, or I was just interested to try the author. None of these I went in expecting to DNF or even to dislike. A couple of them, to be fair, were kind of just, they were just me trying something new or trying something again to give it the 4th, 5th chance. I'm looking at you, Brandon Sanderson. So what didn't work for me amongst these? Well, The League of Gentlewomen Witches, there was just some problematic mental health stuff and sexism that just really pissed me off. So like that was a very clear reason for DNFing. The rest of these I would more put into the category of they just didn't capture me in any way. I think Tress, Witch King, and Ancillary Justice, I found a bit boring. Like there was stuff going on that I knew I was supposed to care about and I just never did. I didn't hate any of those books, I just didn't care. The Keeper 6 and The City We Became, I feel like they were more writing issues for me. Both of those books for me felt like they had issues with repetition, but at the same time not exploring or explaining things that I wanted to know. Both of them also, like the characterization didn't really always work for me. They were both books that I wanted to love. They were exploring topics that I was interested in and they had like interesting concepts, but it was the execution that wasn't working for me. And then The Lies of Lachlan Amora, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I just thought the characterization was really boyish and boring, and the whole foundation of the edginess was reliant on swearing. And like, I'm Australian, so the swearing just was not that impressive to me. I don't know, that book was just cringe to me. Now on to the books that I absolutely hated. Let's start with the only 2 1-stars that I've given out. They both go to Brandon Sanderson, and they are to The Well of Ascension and to The Hero of Ages. I spoke about these books plenty last year. To me, they were tropey, they were problematic, they were boring, and they were predictable. So pretty much they ticked every box that you don't want to tick. Now for my 2.5 and 2-star books. These are the books that I really didn't like. I might often say that I hated them, but I clearly don't hate them in the same way that I hate like The Well of Ascension. It's interesting to me that a lot of these books are fan favorites. These books are absolutely beloved in like the YouTube fantasy space. For example, we've got The House in the Cerulean Sea, Priory of the Orange Tree, Peronessi, Starless Sea, and then we've got sequels in series that had a lot of hype. One is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin and Heart of a Sun Warrior by Su Lin Tan. So books everybody else loves and I just hated. The Winter Garden I had more complex feelings about, and I did a whole video on that, so I'll leave that below if you want to check it out. Basically, I felt like that book did some things very well, in particular like the atmosphere and the setting, but its characterizations and the way that it explored its themes I felt were very disappointing. So that's why it's a dead in the middle 2.5 stars. I don't know that I could say that there's a lot that these books have in common, other than the fact that I just found them like thoroughly disappointing. And honestly, pretty much all of these I thought I was going to love. So I'm not quite sure what to make of this category in particular. One thing that keeps coming to mind that these things have in common, like I said, is the hype around them and my expectations going in. And I don't think I would have liked these books more if I had less expectation. I mean, maybe a little bit, but not dramatically. Like Priory of the Orange Tree would never have gotten a 5-star from me, even if I've never heard of it before, you know what I mean? I think one of the things here is, and I don't know how I would know this before going into a book, but they just felt like their themes and what they were trying to do thematically, I could see what the author wanted to do with the book. It just didn't work for me personally. Whether that was because it kind of contradicted itself, like in The House in the Cerulean Sea, or it all just felt kind of like it was fluff and like it was doing a lot without actually saying something, like Priory or Starless Sea. But I suppose too, all of these are books that I essentially read either because they were sequels in series I was already reading or because they came highly recommended. And I guess I can only hope that as I learn about my own tastes when it comes to fantasy more, I will be better at discerning what will and won't work for me when I'm getting recommendations online. Now, the 3-star books, I don't feel like I have a lot to say about specifically because like I liked them, but I didn't love them. I think in all 4 cases, I just wanted to love them more than I did. That was the feeling that I was left with. If you can see any patterns amongst the books that I didn't like, I would definitely love to hear those in the comments below. Now let's take a look at the books that I liked and that I loved. We'll start first with a 3.5 star. I know it's not a big category, but a lot of these have one very particular thing in common. In fact, all but one of these are historical fantasy romance. But A Marvelous Light and A Restless Truth by Freya Marske are within the same world, and then Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels is a similar vibe. They're all kind of like vaguely Victorian England or like Edwardian England or something, and it's romance, a little bit smutty, and there's also magic. So I think when these things work for me, they're rarely going to be like a new favorite book, but they're a quick, easy read and I have a good time with them. I suppose A Symphony of Echoes could kind of fall into that category. Not quite. It's more sci-fi. It's basically time travel where people from the future do go into the past, and there is a romance. All 4 of these books I would describe as a rompy fun time. So I guess that's the category where my 3.5 stars fall into. Now I'm just going to show you my 4, 4.5 and 5-star reads because something becomes very clear to me when I look at these. Now, clearly popping up quite a lot, we've got series that I just clearly have been really enjoying. The first, as I just mentioned, is the St. Mary's Chronicles by Jodie Taylor. It is sci-fi, but it definitely is very light sci-fi and has strong fantastical elements where, you know, it's set in the future, but our characters are historians who travel into the past to like research and witness historical events. Another series I've been absolutely loving are the Lady Trent memoirs by Marie Brennan. This is set in like an alternative Earth, but it's like they're very clearly like based on Earth, and our main character is essentially like what would be the equivalent of a Victorian lady, just in a world where there's dragons. A duology that has just become, I think, one of my favorite things that I've ever read is The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker. I did do a full video reading The Golem and the Jinni and kind of like a more laid back vlog than reading The Hidden Palace, which is the second book. And at the time of finishing the first book, I think I said I was thinking of giving it about a 4-star, but like I just have not stopped thinking about that book since. I'm obsessed with it. I think it's one of my favorite books of all time. So like sometimes you just need to mull on how a book makes you feel, you know? This is an historical fantasy series set in like the late 1800s, early 1900s in New York. And it is very kind of like low fantasy. We got a few other things in the mix like Daughter of the Moon Goddess, the 5th season, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, The Dawn Hounds. But I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, what the overriding theme amongst an awful lot of these books are. And that is the setting. It's historical. In terms of the books that I didn't like, there are 2 books that fit into that category of historical fantasy. They would be The Winter Garden, which we spoke about. I'm kind of like, I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. And then a book that I DNF'd was The League of Gentlewomen Witches. But when it comes to books that I gave 3.5 stars or above, out of the 20 books in that category, 12 of them are definitely solidly historical fantasy. And that doesn't include the 2 books that are on here that are from the St. Mary's Chronicle series, which again is set in the future, it's science fiction, but like a lot of that is set in the past. We watch our characters spend time in historical events. So, I mean, they kind of fit that theme as well, right? So, I think you can see where I'm going with this. To me, it's pretty clear that historical fantasy is a subgenre that I need to explore more. And if we take the books that are historical fantasy, the ones that I loved, the ones that I hated, and we come up with an average rating for those, it's 3.94. That is a really high average rating, especially when we take a look at my averages for fantasy in general, and it's well above my personal average overall for all of the books that I've ever read. So while I do have a couple of examples of historical fantasy not working for me, I think in general it seems like, I don't want to call it a safe bet, but it's clear that there's something about the atmosphere and the setting that I tend to enjoy. I think too, there's something to be said about like lower fantasy. I'm not saying that I don't ever like high fantasy or epic fantasy. You know, Daughter of the Moon Goddess, 5th season, even the Dawn Hounds, like those are books that are very much like outside of the world as we know it now with pretty big concepts. And I loved those books. But when we're looking consistently through the books that I have enjoyed, a lot of them are much more down to earth. If it's not our world exactly, it's one that's pretty familiar. I do wonder if the fact that I'm very much a character-driven reader and someone who definitely appreciates a really strong sense of atmosphere, is that just something that's easier to do in historical fiction than it is like epic fantasy? Because a lot of the time with that epic fantasy, the author has to spend plenty of the page count like info dumping to some extent. We hope that they do it in a more natural, organic way, but a lot of it is that world building from the ground up. Whereas with historical fantasy, I feel like we're kind of like plopped in and like I have a lot of that background context. Maybe I don't know everything about that particular time and place, but I have some of it, and the author assumes that I have some of it. And so while like building the sense of atmosphere through, you know, like the language that they're using, the kind of words that they're speaking, the dress and the mannerisms and all of that sort of stuff is very important, it's not as dense, I suppose. And instead, there's just an awful lot more space for characters to shine. Now, obviously that is just completely a personal taste thing. I'm not saying that characters in historical fantasy are better than characters who happen to be in epic fantasy. I'm more saying that maybe I just find it easier to connect with them in that setting. And I think too, while I do find, you know, complex magic systems like interesting in theory, I don't think I'm one of those readers who wants to sit and learn about like a science of magic. I want to be told what I need to know, and I want the world to feel kind of magical and whimsical, but I don't need like a video game tutorial of like how the magic works at the beginning of my books. I think additionally, I'm not someone who loves reading action. I don't know whether it's just because I don't really visualize it very well, but a lot of the time I find myself skimming over action scenes and just like wanting to be told what happened or like how it resolved. And again, maybe that just happens a little bit less often in something like an historical fantasy. That's not to say there are not action sequences, but I feel like in historical fantasy, a lot of tension tends to be developed through like personal relationships, politics, and societal kind of constraints or expectations. Like interesting themes that arise out of conflicts between like class or gender, sexuality, race, that sort of stuff can be, I think, really beautifully and like subtly explored through historical fiction. Whereas sometimes I found when epic fantasy tries to tackle these big questions, sometimes it's amazing, and other times it feels a little contrived. At least for me, sometimes it feels like, you know, the author could build their perfect world to make their point rather than exploring the realities of something. I don't know if that makes sense. These are all just total generalizations, and I'm more just kind of like exploring my thinking with you and trying to pinpoint what it is about historical fantasy that I'm clearly liking so much and being gravitated towards. So I think at the end of the day, we can say that yes, I do like fantasy. I just need to get pickier about the kind of fantasy that I read. And in particular, I need to read more historical fantasy. Not to the exclusion of all other fantasy, but it is something that I need to explore more. And so for that reason, if you have any recommendations for me for historical fantasy, especially diverse historical fantasy, please leave your recommendations in the comments below. In fact, I had a little bit of a look on my shelf, and I do have a couple of historical fantasy already. I've got A Skin Full of Shadows by Frances Hardinge. I've got The Monsters We Defy by Leslie Penelope, and The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk, who is an author I've already given 5 stars to this year. So, I mean, I feel like I need to get to that one soon. My plan is to read these along with a couple more historical fantasy books that I come across, and we can do a little bit of like a reading vlog experiment to see how true this is. Am I accurate in my assumption that historical fantasy is something I need to be reading more? Is maybe the genre of fantasy for me? So stay tuned for that video. That'll be coming soon. But in the meantime, thanks so much for hanging out with me and chatting about how my fantasy journey has gone so far. As I said, please do leave your recommendations for especially historical fantasy in the comments below for me. Or if you have any like insight you'd like to offer, taking a look at the books that I have not liked versus the ones that I have, I'd love to hear that too. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and a big thank you goes as always to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. But I'll be back soon with that historical fantasy reading vlog. So until then, happy reading to you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.